this episode of Nothing But a Number, I'm delighted to be joined by Baroness Tanni Grey-Thompson of Eaglescliffe, one of Britain's greatest Paralympic athletes. Tanni has amassed, I think, is it 11 gold, 4 silver and a bronze medal over 16 years and 5 Paralympics. In 2005, she became Dame Tanni Grey-Thompson, and in 2010 was created a life peer. Tanni, welcome. It's great to have you. Can we start into sort of the beginning of your journey? Because I know kind of determination is the key to how you got to be such a great Paralympic athlete. But from the start, I believe your parents were kind of keen that you wouldn't be disadvantaged by your disability, and that you were part of the mainstream from the start.
Yeah, I think sort of some of my parents' early experience. So, my parents were told when I was born, if I'd been born 2 years earlier, I'd been taken away, not fed and allowed to die. And that had a big impact on them. And it was kind of interesting. So, they talked about inclusion before people even thought of the word. And I think both my parents were very keen on education as a way of helping me find my own path. So, my parents fought the system to get me into mainstream education, because back then education was segregated and there was no education for disabled children. I mean, when I was due to go to high school, we went to the school that the Education Authority wanted me to go to, and kids at 15 were playing with sand and water. And my dad was like, that is not happening. And so, a lot of it early on about being active was about just being physically strong enough to push my own chair. And, it's much later, my parents sort of said to me that, it was about leading an independent life. I mean, basically, my dad said to me I was quite an annoying child and they just didn't want me living at home forever. But there were kind of lots of these sliding door moments where I remember I was 11 and I did some horse riding and had the chance to go away for like a week's camp in the summer holidays. And mum talking to another mother and saying, was her daughter going to go? And the other mum said, oh, no, we're not going to let our daughter go because she's going to miss her bedtime story. And this other daughter was like 21. And my mum was like, we are not doing a bedtime story with you. And there was no reason for that child to be in this very infantile relationship. So, there's all these different moments where my parents are like, no, you need to get out and do stuff. So I was really lucky at that they didn't wrap me in cotton wool. And, Paralympic pathway came much later. It was just about being fit and healthy.
Yes. And in terms of fit and healthy, because obviously, you need to have that, you said you need the strength to, in a wheelchair. Did you actually, as a child, develop extra strength, or, what was your sort of attitude to being able to be mobile?
Yeah, so I could walk a little bit when I was very young, and I ended up having to walk with calipers and crutches because my legs just never really developed. And my world was very small, because I couldn't walk very far. And then when I had my first chair, then suddenly my world opened up a lot. And so immediately I saw a lot more things that I could do because of having a wheelchair. But there were loads of people who told my parents, that I'd never get a job, I'd never get married, all these, quite discriminating things because I was in a chair. And mum and dad just ignored it. And for different reasons. My dad had been quite ill as a child and had been wrapped in kind of cotton wool by his parents. My mum's parents were much older when they had her, so she was a bit of a surprise baby. So they were a little bit protective of her because of that. So I think mum and dad together were very keen that me and my sister would just, not be wrapped in cotton wool.
I mean, I was really surprised when I read, correct me if this is not accurate, but the fact that you were the first female wheelchair user in the world to present on television when you presented BBC Two's groundbreaking From the Edge. And that was, quite relatively recently, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think I'm probably one of the first. It's probably a bit more. I was sort of the first disabled ex-athlete to present Olympics and work on things like that. So, there's lots of it. Growing up, I didn't see disabled people on TV. I saw Sandy Richards from Crossroads and Ironside, both non-disabled actors. So disability wasn't shown. And in society, disabled people were very much locked away as well. So either through the education system or institutionalized. So, apart from doing riding for the disabled, you just didn't see disabled people anywhere. And so in some ways, I think at the time it was good because I didn't grow up in this very negative world. But now I think you do need to kind of be able to see the pathway through. And a really important moment for me was watching the London Marathon on TV as a teenager and seeing elite disabled athletes. And I was already in sport by then, but suddenly it was like, oh, great, I can see the pathway. And that was really important for me.
I remember very clearly that the sort of transition of where disability sport became mainstream. I think maybe the 2012 the London Olympics, was a massive step forward in terms of televised coverage in this country. From the kind of inside, I'm sure, it's really interesting how you've transitioned from being a highly successful sports person to being a prominent figure for advocacy, for disability being more visible and better understood. How important is that for you? An ongoing basis?
It's really important, understanding that lived experience. So I'm treated three ways. One is an ex-athlete, very nice. One is the parliamentarian, a bit mixed. Yeah. And then the third is a disabled woman where I experience a reasonable amount of discrimination. So as an athlete, I got to travel the world. I saw how women, disabled people were treated in other jurisdictions, looked at other legislation. I actually did a politics degree at university, never planned to go into politics. But then actually I just, through my time, competed. I did lots of other things. So I think people assume I ended up in the Lords because I used to be an athlete, but that's kind of quite a small part of my career. It's just the bits of my career are not terribly well known. So I sat on the National Disability Council, which oversaw the implementation of the Disability Discrimination Act. I sat on a couple of government commissions looking at votes at 16. I did lots of other things. I worked in sport. I worked for British Athletics and I sat on the board of Sport Wales and sat on the board of UK Sport England. So I did lots of sort of different roles in sport and in social justice. And then, having the chance to go and sit in the Lords, which is an amazing place. I mean, it's the least misogynistic place I've ever worked. I can't say that for both ends of the building. No. But there is something that when you become a peer, generally people are just accepting because you've been through a process to get there. And for me, it was too big an opportunity to turn down because you've got the chance to input and change legislation. So there's different bits. There's what you can change by legislation and what you can change by education. And I'm a little bit over, we still get a lot of, people need to be educated in disability. Well, yeah, we kind of do. But, and as much 2012 was an incredible games and it absolutely raised the profile of Paralympics, but it didn't change the world for disabled people. And I guess a bit of a challenge for me is that, it was 14 years ago now, and there's still a lot to do. Trains were meant to be step free by January the 1st, 2020. It's now going to be 100 years before I can get on the train without permission or support of a non-disabled person. So pretty much the only thing I post on social media is about trains, because all I want is the same miserable experience of commuting as everyone else gets. I don't even get that. So, the education bit is the social media. So I was on a train yesterday, and a young man sort of said to me, do you need a ramp or wait? And he'd seen some stuff that a friend of mine had posted. So for me, there's loads of levers that you can pull, and we've got to utilize all those levers because the reality is disabled people still experience loads of discrimination and loads of exclusion, and we've still got a huge amount to do.
Yeah, I mean, I know you've spoken on things like the quality of wheelchairs and the fact that if you don't have the right tools to get around, then it doesn't matter how much you want to be free. I mean, it's really interesting. It sounds as though you I don't know if joy is the right word, but you value the ability to speak in the House of Lords. I think you'll know that a lot of people maybe underestimate the importance of the House of Lords. Would you like to say, well, in your opinion, how good a thing it is, and that we don't want to start abolishing it anytime soon?
Well, it's a bit like turkeys voting for Christmas. So, I mean, it's interesting. We do get people who accept positions of the House of Lords who fundamentally want to kind of throw it out the window, which I think is quite interesting, actually, that, they see ways of doing it. So, I'm quite clear, our role is not to run the country. Our role is to say to the government of the day, would you like to have another think? And the public love and hate us depending on what we're doing. So, if they like what we're doing, they suddenly think we're brilliant, and then they'll change their mind and dislike it. I think we've got lots of challenges, so that, if there's a picture of us in the media, it's usually state opening where we're all in ermine robes, and, that's not real. It's a bit like Prime Minister's questions. That is not the real bit of politics. That's the theatre of it. I could buy my own ermine robes. I have to rent them if I want to go to state opening. I think they're 20 grand if you want to buy them. Wow. So, I don't have a family where we have ermine robes in the thing. And so, a frustration is the media will talk about, there's 800 members of the House of Lords. Well, actually, there's about 450 who regularly sit. And, we've got some people who don't come very often, not because they're lazy, but because they're out in the real world working in a thing that they're an expert in. So what was made very clear to me when I went is that you're expected to remain an expert in the thing that got you there. So, you're not talking about what happened in sport 20 years ago or 30 years ago. You're talking about what happened in sport last week. And so, I think for most of us, you kind of accept that there's a view of us that might not be real. And I want to say to people, I think the whole of politics needs a bit of a rethink. The Commons needs, I think, some restructuring as much as the Lords. But also just be a bit careful what you wish for. If there is an element, if we suddenly all go to be elected, and I don't know whether, I absolutely genuinely have no clue whether I'd stand or if I get elected. But either everything gets through or nothing gets through, depending the timing of elections and what parties put into power. At least with that, I mean, I think we're a fairly constant sort of pain in the neck to the Commons. And I think that's kind of what we should be doing. So it'll be interesting, that there may or may not be changes, but I think we realize when we're most successful, it's when the government of the day threatens to abolish us. That means we're doing a good job because we're being a pain in the neck.
Absolutely. I mean, it's interesting. People have said to me, well, of course, if you were in the House of Lords, you'd be young because the average age is 70, and they make a big thing in the comments about the fact that these are all people, and when they're being unkind, they would say they're sort of out of touch. You've made the point, I think, which I would agree with, that the House of Lords is very much full of experts in their field and people who can take the time to reflect on sometimes government motions that are put through that have been maybe rushed, should we say, and to actually, I think one of the kind of the key ones that was highlighted recently was the Levelling Up Bill, which was like a tome so large it tried to sort of shovel everything. They described it as a Christmas tree, don't they? It tried to shovel everything into one bill, and I know the Lords took a great and detailed look at it, and that I think the people, the public don't understand, do they? That really important function, which is to unpick legislation.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you look at it, in the Lords, anyone who wants to table an amendment, it will be debated, and we can talk for as long as we want, which is not always a good thing. Sometimes it is. But I think people don't always understand that votes in the Commons, stuff's guillotined, yes, have quite limited, ability to debate some things, and it's our job to kind of do it line by line. And sometimes that means a lot of late nights, but that I think you know what you're signing up to. I mean, the other thing with the Lords is that, as an athlete, I was considered really old when I retired. Then I went into the Lords, and briefly at 39, I was the youngest peer. And obviously we've got a couple of much, much younger now. Part of the Lords is about having that lived life experience. And I think when I went there, I kind of looked at some of the ages of some of the people and thought, wow, they're really old. But then you listen to them speak. And actually, that's kind of interesting. When you get new members of Parliament who really dislike the House of Lords, a lot of them will, if they come and listen to a debate, will then say, actually, every view that is possibly represented in wider society, people feel quite safe to talk about their views in the House of Lords. And it's having that, quite sometimes uncomfortable views. There will be people out in the real world that think those very uncomfortable things. So, that's, I think, a big strength of how the place works. I mean, it's completely mad, and, some of our rules of, it only becomes afternoon when the mace is in the chamber. So Monday and Tuesdays 2:30, Wednesdays 3, Thursday 11, and Fridays 10. So, at 1 o'clock on a Monday, people will be saying good morning, and, there's some completely bonkers things. But then, what we're trying to do is have a rational, mostly sensible debate and represent, people's views from the outside world.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. I mean, people don't understand that in the Commons, quite often you're restricted to 3 minutes to speak on something, and that tends to be a soundbite for social media, and not much else. And so the substance of the debate happens outside the chamber in, committee rooms, but the Lords is a really important aspect of that. And you're absolutely right when you touched on misogynism and, being different in other places, and ageism as well, I would say, because there is a suggestion that that maybe older people are out of touch, and you quite rightly said that it's about keeping up to date in whatever your specialism is, and your biological age doesn't affect how engaged you are with society, and with your specialist subject.
Yeah, and I think that's something I've absolutely learned from being there, that age is a number. Exactly, part of what you're doing. It's that don't make assumptions about somebody because of their age, either way. So, some of our younger members that have joined, they've been criticised for being very young, but there is I'm not entirely sure what is the right age to come into the Lords. I think absolute lived experience does matter, but don't write people off. So, I work with people in their 90s who will have forgotten more than I've, will ever learn in my life. And then you look at it. I mean, I always think it's worth looking at the backgrounds of people, who sit in the Lords. So yeah, we've got some unbelievably well-off people, rich, not well-off, rich. But they may have left school at 14 with no qualifications and built a business. Until relatively recently, there were more women in the Lords than in the Commons, more state-educated people in the Lords and the Commons, so there's 26 different religions represented in the Lords. And it is very, different. And there was one funny moment, and I'd come out of the chamber in a debate, and it was sparky for the House of Lords, which means it wasn't sparky at all. And a member of the public said, "Oh, it's just full of old men." Like, who was that one? He was talking like Joel Joffrey, Lord Joffrey. Oh, well, what's he ever done? Human rights lawyer. Oh, yeah, well, human rights lawyer. Yeah, so what's he ever really done in his life? And it's like, he got Nelson Mandela off the death penalty. Yeah. And it was one of those moments that if it had been, it wouldn't have been quite so cool. But yeah, the world's changed. I'd say, certainly the vast majority of people I work with are connected to the world. Don't just look at where they are in their life now, but kind of look at everything that they bring to the chamber. And I think that's kind of really important.
Do you think I think it's important in both houses, and sadly, I don't think in the Commons that anybody's backstory is really looked at in any great detail, and the fact that experience is quite useful in lawmaking, should apply in both houses, but I think it applies less. Kind of moving on to what I think some of the issues that are well, I guess going to be coming up in the new Parliament, regardless of who the government is. And I know you've spoken a lot about advocating against assisted dying. I understand that that's something that I read recently that Sir Keir Starmer is possibly likely to be supporting. To what extent does your experience within the Lords and in life in general form your opinion on, you know, your view on assisted dying?
Yeah, it informs it quite a lot. So, you know, quite often people with a similar view as me, you know, it will be said, oh, well, you're doing actually religious. You know, I'm an atheist. You know, I don't have faith. For me, I see every day the discrimination that disabled people experience, and where we're written off, we're told we have no value. You know, a lot of the narrative over quite a few years has been about disabled people as being benefit scroungers and sucking money out of the state, and, you know, really not positive. And, you know, 50% of the disabled people who could work aren't in work. So there's lots of, you know, narratives which aren't helpful. And, you know, I've had people say to me, you know, if my life was like yours, I'd kill myself. And you're like, I have a really privileged life. So, you know, the assumption that being a wheelchair user is like the worst thing that could ever happen. And, you know, there was a debate where somebody, you know, for them said, you know, they couldn't bear to be incontinent. They would want to end their life if they were incontinent. And it's like, well, I'm technically incontinent. I have to catheterize. You know, if I don't do that, I would be. And, you know, I kind of don't choose to do it, but it's not the worst thing in my life. So it's the assumptions that we make about people. And, you know, the vast majority of disabled people I know have multiple times a month, if not weekly, are told they have no value in society. So would be pushed towards it. And then you layer on that, you know, COVID and the compulsory do not attempt resuscitation orders that were put on disabled people without their knowledge or discussion. You know, I just worry it changes our relationship with society and our social contracts. And, you know, you start looking at other jurisdictions around the world, and, you know, in 9 years in Canada, where they started and where they are now. And, you know, now a lot of people who want to change the law are distancing themselves from Canada. But there, if you're anorexic, you fit the criteria, because without treatment, you will die. So, you know, in Canada, you can request it for being poor. And there's a story, Christine Gauthier, Canadian Paralympian, she requested some financial support to build a ramp outside her house, and she was offered the drugs to end her life.
No.
So, you know, European jurisdictions, you know, if you hit 70 with no underlying health condition, you can request it for being old. And I don't think 70 is old anymore. I mean, not least because I'm 54, I'm kind of getting closer to it, but partly around the people I work with, you know, it comes back to the average age. People I work with, you know, no. And so there's multiple reasons I just really worry about it. And, you know, there's a lot of stuff that gets thrown around. Doctors do it already. Well, I don't. You know, I just think it will change. And that settled wish, it's very hard to define it, and whether, you know, there will be the time and the effort and the money spent to decide whether it is genuinely a settled wish or it's, you know, coercion, I think will just erode. And, you know, a colleague of mine said, you know, where there's a will, there's a relative. And, you know, that just stuck with me a lot.
Yes. Well, no, you're absolutely right about age. So I'm 71 and I'm just getting started. You know, it really is just a number. But I mean, it's interesting that the assessment of who makes a valuable contribution to life and who is expendable, I suppose, is a really difficult one for the medical profession to define, I would guess, because it's as much about the person themselves being given the opportunity, the confidence, and to feel valued and you know, to have an active role to play. I mean, I guess there is another category, that there's been a lot about motor neurone disease. Obviously, with the story that's covered in Coronation Street, and and the the sad death of Rob Burrows. The question of if you have an obvious sort of terminal illness that requires sort of ever more, you have a loss of limbs and everything, whether that is a different case from, obviously, the example of somebody with anorexia, whether you can kind of subdivide, what would be a reasonable case to be made for somebody choosing to end their life, as opposed to a medical case for saying, well, all of these illnesses you can, and if a relative says, I think that they're ill enough that they should, as opposed to a genuine medical challenge.
It's really hard, I think, once you start trying to subdivide some of these things, which is yes, they're in and no, they're not in. And some of the people who've brought high court cases to try and change the law, actually some of their conditions wouldn't have qualified. So it's how so doctors, will very clearly say, given a 6-month diagnosis is a bit of a kind of finger in the air. You're trying to make a best case judgment. The other bit about the settled wish is that, how do you so our Mental Capacity Act isn't fully enforced in the UK, and so if we go down that route of bringing in, there's lots of other bits of legislation that would also be required. So to doctors, do they know you? Do they not know you? Are they able to spot? Doctors aren't trained to spot coercion. And last year we've done a lot of work in Parliament on coercive relationships, and so if it happens in a domestic environment, then why wouldn't it also impact this? And there's a number of conditions which are just horrible. Motor neuron, is one of them. And it's I've had friends who've been through it, died. It's cruel, but changing the law to end people's lives just brings a different set of issues. And I think for me, I'd rather see proper palliative care, lots of support for people, and help for the families, so people have time to be with their loved ones and not actually sort of ground down by care and responsibility. Now, it's a different problem in terms of how you pay for it. But in Oregon, which is one of the jurisdictions that's had it for the longest amount of time, being a burden is one of the biggest reasons that people choose to end their lives, not intolerable pain, which again is quite hard to measure. So, what's pain to me is not pain to somebody else. So, what I would say to people is that, the top line, 2 doctors, 6 months, settle wish, are great sound bites, but the devil is for everything, every bit of legislation we do, devil's in the detail. It's like, what drugs to use, where can you end your life, how will they be administered, who will administer them, will your family be, there's lots of questions. And the drugs bit is not the pleasant, it's a very hard bit to talk about, but no jurisdiction in the world has approved the drugs. They just use a fairly random cocktail. And in many cases, what I hope for my death is I just fall asleep and don't wake up. And that's what people, because we don't talk about death because it's not very nice. And what's on the other side, and all these things that we don't want to talk about. But in many cases, it's not you take one pill and you slip away. There's numerous cases of it being really very unpleasant for the family around. So, what I just say is just look beyond the sound bites to actually what would change in our society if this becomes law.
It's interesting you raise the not exactly alternative, but that we need to do more about palliative care and end of life care. And I've been saying this for a long time, that we are afraid as a society to talk about death and to address it, and the need to invest in that quality of end of life care is something that we've kind of reneged on as a society. In that, when the National Health Service was set up, it was supposed to be from cradle to grave, but it's actually from cradle to just before, when you're close to your last days, but not there yet. And we rely on the hospice movement without funding it fully, and the support networks are not adequate for people's needs. And I think that part of looking at our attitude to age as we become an ever older society has to be that why do we think that one aspect of our health is more important than actually looking after people in their final days, and making it something that is not burdensome, which is, as you say, the key to why people opt for the other option.
Yeah, and palliative care is a postcode lottery. There's a lot of misinformation out there, sadly, about pain relief, that I think, and this is again very difficult to say, people, you don't want your loved ones to suffer. But the idea is, I get a lot of people saying, oh, well, the doctor gave my grandmother a bit of morphine and she slipped away. And it's like, there's always that last cup of tea. There's always that last pain relief injection. There's always, so, I think we need to be thinking about that. But also, we need to be thinking about us being a fit and healthy nation. So we say we're a nation that likes sport. We're a nation that likes watching sport. We're not really a nation that's terribly active. And, we need to build in physical activity. So this sounds very harsh when I say it, but you want people to be as fit and healthy and as active right the way through their life. Because what we're seeing now in British society is people are hitting frailty in their 40s and they're living for 35 years with frailty, which means the quality of life is pretty miserable. And so what you want people to be as fit and healthy as long as they can, and then pass away quickly, not spend 30 years dying. Now that sounds really horrible when I say it, but there's so much more we need to do around the NHS because it is not sustainable in current format. Diabetes costs the nation 10 billion a year, and it's okay. So for me, it's like, I don't think it's sensible just to keep giving people drugs and they don't change their lifestyle. Now, eating well comes at a cost, and there's a lot of people who right now with cost of living are struggling to eat well, and to have, your fruit and veg and all these different things. But, just writing prescriptions is not the answer. I want the NHS to stay free at the point of delivery for everybody. But if we're not careful, it's not going to remain that way. And then it's going to be very much a two-tier system in this country, which is, you see it in the States and a lot of other countries I visited. Mm-hmm. And it's not a great place to be if you're not supported.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I mean, I did a lot of work around diet and healthy eating and how prevention is so much better than tackling diabetes after it happens. I was accused of being sort of a supporter of the nanny state, which is this term for sort of government shouldn't intervene in things. But I do think in preventative health care and setting the direction, there is a role for public health and government. But I mean, interestingly, the general health of the nation, is that something that each individual just has to sort of take responsibility for, and government's got no role to play? Or is it something that genuinely we need to make it easier for people? I mean, I know I spoke on, there've been something like 69 different obesity strategies in the last 30 years, and none of them have been implemented. It's kind of, well, how are we going to shift the dial on this? Because we all know that it's essential, and yet nothing seems to change.
People don't tend to worry about their health until they're ill. And something you kind of kick the can down the road on instead of thinking about prevention. And there is a role that government has to play in this. You could build physical activity into school life. So there's a reason that a lot of certainly our Olympic medalists come from independent schools, not Paralympians, because there's a whole different reason for that. But it's not just about some of it's parents. Many parents have got money to take their kids to multiple sporting events, but a lot of it is around that it's embedded into the school day. So every day those children will be being active, but also they're being taught PE in the prep school by trained PE teachers, not as what happens in the state sector, is that it'll be the PE teacher that is the sporty one, which might actually only mean you go to Zumba or, you know, any other kind of activity. Or, you know, when you've done your teacher training, you get 4 hours being taught how to deliver PE. Now, first of all, I couldn't be a primary school teacher at all. But if you don't love physical activity, trying to teach PE with 30 children who are all at completely different points of their physical literacy journey, it is like herding sheep. It is just really difficult. And so for me, you could change the curriculum quite quickly. You could change the teacher training quite quickly. You can do after school clubs and not just lump it something else on for teachers to do, but you build that into the day. But also, you know, there's so much we need to do. So girls still, this hasn't changed since I was in school. Mm-hmm. Girls start disengaging with physical activity at 8 because we value sporty boys more than we value sporty girls. And then by 13, they're completely disengaged. And it's about what they wear, how they're perceived, the media coverage around them. You know, it's just, it's not easy. It's not easy being a boy, but it's not easy being a young girl in trying to be active, because we're meant to be beautiful and lovely and have our hair done. And we're not meant to look sweaty and snotty and, you know, some of the clothes you're meant to wear, you know, just, ugh. So there's lots of things we could do to change. Social prescribing, I have to say, you know, is developing and moving on. But GPs don't know how to prescribe physical activity. Doctors are pretty unhealthy because of the hours they work. So they don't do it themselves. So if they don't do it themselves, they're not going to, tell people what else to do. And I was talking to a friend of mine, actually, his son's a doctor in Canada and he's a GP, and he was just saying he has his own patients. And so he knows, you know, his patients, and they're much more able to go through prevention and get people thinking about their lifestyles and that little bit of lifestyle coaching, you know. And so, you know, you're not telling people not to drink alcohol, but you're saying, think about the alcohol you drink. So so I do think government has a role, and local government has a role, but the budget cuts that they're facing, you know, they're making really big decisions and closing physical activity spaces because they've got health and social care to pay for, which takes a massive chunk of the budget. So, you know, are we going to go back to the 1950s and 60s where we all looked after our grandparents at home? And, you know, that's nonsense. But it comes back to that social contract again, is what do we expect from government? Do we expect everything to be paid for, support, you know, talk about wheelchairs, you know, just when I was a kid, there were 2 wheelchairs. There was a child's chair and an adult's chair. And that's moved now, that there's a huge range of chairs which were available, which is brilliant. But then, you know, ultimately with all this stuff, somewhere along the lines, we've got to pay for it. Mm. And, you know, never thought I'd quote Theresa May, but, you know, there is no magic money tree.
Yeah.
So, you know, we've got to think not just about reform of the NHS or reform of education, and a bit like, you know, every government wants to be the one that reforms the NHS.
Yeah.
You know, we've got to think of it more holistically about what we do, because it's only going to get worse, and we're only going to get people getting older, less fit, less healthy, less able to work, and that's going to cause us more problems.
Yeah, and don't you think that we regard old people and aging as a problem rather than, you know, potentially also an opportunity to, if we can have people staying fitter for longer, that they make an active contribution to the economy, you know, which, you know, with the sort of low productivity and challenges at the moment would actually be a good thing. But I mean, it's interesting, you went back to the kind of school activities and the you know, the absence of sufficient sport in schools. I also think that possibly there's a time in, I don't know, midlife, say, when, you know, people who have family and they've grown up, where they need to then look after their own health, you say sort of pre-diabetes and pre the things kicking in that are then going to last for the rest of their lives. And there doesn't seem to me to be an offer, and I'm not suggesting for a minute that it should be a state offer. It's maybe, the private sector should be looking at, gyms for the over 55s, or something that basically appeals to people of the kind of baby boomer generation, whereas they don't necessarily want to go to these gyms where you've got people sort of flexing their muscles and posing in front of mirrors and, trying to be sort of Mr. Universe, but just want to do it for their health.
Yeah, and that's the other thing, is like, if you've never gone into a gym or you've disengaged with physical activity, how do you know what to do?
Yeah.
And for me, because kind of big chunk of my life was being an athlete, then you've kind of got a really good idea of the things that you need to do. So sports like netball have done some really interesting things where they've brought women back into netball, and there's walking football, walking netball. Governing bodies are having to diversify, because children now don't want to play sport the same way that I did, and there's also like a load of choices about what sports you can do for some people, not for everyone, of course, but so again, come back to mums will put themselves last every single time. They will think it's important for their children to eat or be active, or their husband to be active before them. And, I've been talking about this for a year. We know mums set a really positive example with their children if they're able to be active with their children in a different way from dads. And, we need to be better at getting mums active. And I think what we thought for a long time is people played sport and they stayed in sport, and they're always, the ones but people dip in and out as well at different points in their life. When your kids are very young, or when your parents are not well, and it's finding that way to keep them engaged longer, but teach people about the activity to do. So, it always makes me laugh in London where they talk about being active, and they'll say, get to a bus stop earlier. And it's like, well, where I live in the northeast of England, I'm going to be 2 miles down the dual carriageway, or, there's one bus a day. So, it's understanding the environment around you as well. And, I think we've got to do something pretty quickly to get people to think about, how act. But when you're worried about money and, all these different things, which are, of a massive concern, being active is bottom of the list. And there's also, there's some great summer clubs and things around. But when I was involved with a couple of years ago, Mama brought her kids, and at the end of the second day, she said they can't come back for the rest of the week because they're coming home too hungry and can't put food on the table. And it's like, so you can talk as much as you want about being physically active, but if you can't afford to speak to kids, you don't want them being active.
Yeah, of course. I have to say, one of the most challenging things I did in the 4.5 years I was the MP in Stoke-on-Trent Central was a 2-hour training session with the local wheelchair basketball team. I have never felt so exhausted in all my life. And the challenge of scoring a hoop, whatever, I was determined to do it, and I couldn't do it sort of facing forwards. And so somebody said, "Why don't you shoot backwards?" And it took 2 hours, and finally I got one in, and we managed to video it, and so it was kind of way, knows how to do it, but it was incredibly challenging. There's a couple of questions I always like to ask my guests, and one of them is, if you were able to give a piece of advice to your much younger self, knowing what you know now, what would it be?
Probably a few rows with people I've had along the way that I probably should have learned to keep my mouth shut. But actually at the time I felt passionate about what I was arguing for. So I do a lot of work on duty of care in sport and athletes' rights. And, athletes don't have a lot of power or voice within the sports movement. So, I talk about that. It's like, don't write anything off. At 21, I was like, I'm never going to work in politics because that's for losers. Mm-hmm. And then, that's where my path took me. So I think what I learned from being young is just try and make the most of every opportunity. And never say never. So yeah, there's probably quite a few things that would have tell my younger self.
Great. And I'm not sure if you've even thought about a bucket list yet, but what do you still have that you desperately want to do, to be on your CV?
Oh, making public transport better. Just, so disabled people can use. I mean, a lot of it's around disability. Whichever government comes into power, there's going to be, welfare reform. That's going to come to us pretty quickly. I think we need a radical change of the system, not tinkering around the edges. It's a bit like the NHS, it's not affordable in its current format. And I think there's a lot to do around employment in terms of, getting people, into work and everything that brings, in terms of, just making you get out of bed in the morning and focus and money and, a social contract. So, I've got a really, really long list of things that I want to do.
And so aside from politics, at a personal level, is there a country that you've always wanted to visit, or something that you haven't had time to do, I guess, because of your busy life, that whenever you slow down, which I suspect will be in about 40 years' time.
I was really lucky as an athlete. I got to travel a lot, which was really nice. I got to work in Tokyo for the Paralympics, but because of lockdown, I wasn't allowed actually to move around Tokyo. So, my bucket list for somewhere to go would be back to Japan. And I was allowed out on the very last night I was there, and suddenly thought, this is amazing. I'll get some really amazing Japanese food, because I lived in basically the broadcast centre and lived on meatballs and pasta, which is the food that you get in broadcast centres all over the world. And we only found one place open by the time I finished work, and it was this little restaurant underneath the railway arches by the railway station. And it was like, and the chef was like an open kitchen, and I was like, and we went in, and the chef was so excited. He made me chips. I was like, I don't want chips. Don't give me chips. Anyway, so Japan. I'd love to go back to Japan.
Yeah. Well, it was such a shame, wasn't it, that it was locked down throughout the Olympics, because it would have been a completely different Olympics in that. Tanni, thank you so much. It's been a really brilliant conversation, and I've learned a lot more from you, and I look forward to following your progress with all those things in the House of Lords.
Thank you. Thank you very much.